Leonard Nimoy is an actor. In the late 60s, he was cast as First Science Officer Spock in a new TV show called Star Trek. Now, as most of you know, Star Trek only met with kind of a middling success. It was canceled after 3 seasons. Now, Leonard, I call him Leonard, I don't know him at all, managed to work for a little while longer. He was in Mission Impossible, and he was also in some TV movies, and he did some live theater, and he did some speaking engagements. But his career wasn't really, well, let's just say he wasn't the living legend he is today. He was just a TV actor, kind of out of work. So in 1975, he wrote his first autobiography, and he called it I Am Not Spock. The book was a flop. Worse than a flop, it was actually a joke. It became this sort of punchline for the self-loving actor to pen this autobiography telling everybody how great he was when, at the time, he was just this sort of TV actor who hadn't really done much with his life. So the general public kind of took it as a gag. And of course, Star Trek fans were upset. They thought that he was basically telling them, I'm better than Star Trek, and by extension, I'm better than you. But the reality was, Leonard Nimoy was out of work. Or rather, he was working, but he was working in jobs like this that weren't really quite what he wanted to do with his life. So he was really trying to get this message out that he was capable of doing something more than just being Spock. But because the book was a failure, he didn't get those job offers. Only one thing came in, and that was for In Search Of, which was a documentary series, a syndicated show, very low budget. And even though it didn't really offer him a whole lot of money and not a whole lot to do, he took it anyway. And I'll go back to this later on. Okay, now you have probably found yourself in Leonard Nimoy's shoes once or twice in your life. I don't know if anybody here has parents. I do. And if you have parents like me, you've probably experienced the phenomenon that I call being treated like you're 5 years old, even when you're 25 or 35 or 45. I think sometimes that there's a biological switch that goes off in people's brains the moment they have a child that says, I am never going to be able to relate to this person as a rational adult. The rest of my life, my job is to make sure they don't burn their hand on the stove or read in dim lighting or hang out with the wrong crowd. And your parents probably aren't alone. There are people in your life, friends, colleagues, people in the industry, who feel the same way, that you're sort of trapped in time in their memories of what you used to do. So if you used to be Spock, they think, well, you're always going to be Spock, even when you're like, I'm not Spock. Now, if you're sitting here in this room, and you are, you're in a volatile industry. And more to the point, your own career is pretty volatile. 10 years from now, you're probably going to be doing something totally different, maybe. Technologies change, fads in design and animation changes. And if you're a creative person, chances are you might just get bored with what you're doing right now. And 10 years down the line, you want to change it. But what's the maddening thing about this industry is that it's all about the creativity. You know that you can take on just about anything that comes your way, and if you have the ideas and you have the creativity, you can make it work. But then you're stuck in this industry, and if you've ever been on a job interview or trying to land a client, you've experienced this, where they say, well, but what we're really looking for is someone who has already done this exact same brand new thing that we're trying to do now. And you have not done that before. You are Spock. You can only be Spock. And we're not looking for Spock, even though you're like, I'm not Spock. Let's get to this in a moment. You can look at this pretty picture for a while. This is sort of the story of my life, in a sense. And I'm not going to tell you the story of my life, but this experience of having people kind of being slow on the uptake of what you're trying to do with your life is the story of my life. This is the film I did in 1999. Now, I wanted to be a filmmaker since I was 7 years old. And I actively pursued it probably around the time I was 17. The problem is I never told anybody that I wanted to be a film director. To me, it sounded like a very arrogant thing to do. And I knew you couldn't just jump in and start directing films. So I felt, okay, I better sort of worm my way up to the top. So when I was a kid, I had a background in drawing. I got into animation when I was a teenager, and I applied to CalArts for their animation program. And when I was accepted into CalArts, the moment I got the letter, I said to myself, great, now I don't have to do animation anymore. It was really just a means to get in and to start doing live action work. But the thing is, when I graduated CalArts, you still couldn't just go and get a job as a film director. So I fell back on my drawing background and became a graphic designer because I had to put food on the table. And it was a good job for a few years, it was fine, but I decided, well, I still want to make movies. So I made my first movie, Foreign Correspondence, feature film, and I premiered it in 1999. And at this premiere, a friend of mine from CalArts was there. He was actually in the live action program. And before the movie started, he saw this poster and he went up to me and said, wait, this is an animation? And I have to say, it's not like I hadn't seen this guy for 7 years, even though it was 7 years after college. But I'd seen him every year. Like, we hung out at parties, we talked on the phone, we knew each other really well. And okay, he was kind of a self-absorbed guy. He really kind of tuned out whenever I had anything to say. But the thing that struck me was that through those 7 years, I had not communicated to him what I really wanted to do with my life. And so as far as he was concerned, I was still an animator, even though I hadn't animated a damn thing in 9 years. Anyway, he liked the film. But it brings me to a saying I have, which is, first impressions can mark you for life, if you're not careful. A year before this, while I was still finishing the film, I was leaving one job as a graphic designer for another, where I was going to be working as an art director. And someone I worked with, who shall remain nameless because, frankly, this is what I think of him, did actually give me some really good advice. When I left, he said, Mark, when you introduce yourself to people at parties or functions or whatever, never say, hi, I'm a graphic designer and also a filmmaker. They're only going to hear the first part. They're going to tune out for the second part. Always just say, I'm a filmmaker. And what he said actually made a lot of sense, in the same sense that if you ever meet an actor at a party and you ask them what they do, they don't say, oh, I'm a waiter. Oh, and I'm also an actor. No, they go, I'm an actor. That's what they do. Now, even though I'm standing up here talking about myself, I'm actually very modest about my accomplishments. I tend to downplay everything that I do. So when I tell people, yes, I've made a couple of films, they say, oh, well, where can I see them? I say, oh, you can't see them anywhere. Or, oh, yeah. So when I'm trying not to be arrogant by telling people, no, these are great films, I poured my heart and soul into them, they're wonderful, you should spend your time with them, instead I wind up shooting myself in the foot because, I feel uncomfortable making a fool out of myself. Leonard Nimoy clearly was happy to make a fool out of himself. By publishing this book, he was willing to take the heat for doing something stupid because it was that important to him that the world knew who he thought he was and what he wanted to do with his life. I'm not here to give you advice. I'm really here to give myself advice because I think there's a lot of things we can take from Leonard's life and his struggle with being taken seriously. Now let's go back to In Search Of, because this is important too. When he took this job, it was obviously a very low-budget job. But the thing is, because it was low-budget, syndicated television, there wasn't a whole lot of pressure to knock one out of the ballpark with every episode of In Search Of. So Leonard had a little room to grow. Now, he always wanted to direct. He wanted to direct since Star Trek. And in fact, he did direct something in 1973, an episode for Night Gallery, the old Rod Serling show. But during the run of In Search Of, he said, well, I'm actually kind of obsessed with Vincent van Gogh and his art. It's my passion. And I would love to write and direct an episode about Vincent van Gogh, even though it had nothing to do with unexplained phenomena. And they said, you know what? Sure, go ahead. We like you. We've gotten to trust you and know you. You're a good guy. It's In Search Of. Whatever. Okay, fine. So he did, and he actually parlayed that into a one-man show where he played Theo and read, I guess, the letters. And he wound up directing that for TV. So he was slowly kind of worming his own way up through the system. Now, around this time, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was given the green light by Paramount to produce Star Trek the Motion Picture, finally take this dead TV show and bring it onto the screen. Now, it did well enough to put Leonard Nimoy back on the radar as an actor, and also to give Paramount the encouragement to proceed with an actual film franchise. So they went to Star Trek II. And Star Trek II did really well and really sort of set the tone and started building an audience for Star Trek again. So they decided to go ahead with the Star Trek III. At this point, Leonard Nimoy decided it was the perfect time to make a fool of himself again. And what he did was, he asked if he could direct Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Now, at this point, it wasn't really coming out of left field because he had quietly built up a career as a director. He did the Night Gallery thing, he did the In Search of stuff. He even directed an episode of T.J. Hooker, the William Shatner cop show, which makes you wonder how he got that job. But by that, of course, he had known the cast, he'd known the crew, he knew Star Trek. They trusted him. They felt that he was a competent person, intelligent person, logical person, if you will. So they gave him the job, and that's him directing Star Trek III. Now, Star Trek III did well enough, and they decided he was a good enough director. He proved himself, so they hired him to do Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Now, Star Trek IV came out in 1986, and it was by far the most successful Star Trek movie, all the way up until the J.J. Abrams reboot in 2009. Why? Because it was funny, because it was accessible. It wasn't geekery, it wasn't just sci-fi. It took place in 1986, and it was very enjoyable. So the success of that film led Leonard Nimoy to this. Now, you can't get much further from Spock than directing Three Men and a Baby. But Leonard Nimoy directed Three Men and a Baby, and I'm actually sorry to say Three Men and a Baby was the biggest box office smash of 1987. It made more money than every other movie released that year. So it was finally as if the world was saying, okay, Leonard, we get it. You're not Spock. You're this guy who can direct movies and make it funny and make money for everybody and do Three Men and a Baby and everything. So he was like, all right, I did it. But he didn't get there because of these people, much as they loved him and much as he loved them. Now, he got there because of this guy, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. Now, I don't want to mislead you. It was actually this guy, Harve Bennett, who was the writer-producer of Star Trek III, who actually gave Leonard Nimoy the job to direct. But it's the same thing. Both Roddenberry and Bennett, there's Bennett with Nimoy right there, they had a friendship, let's say a kinship, with Leonard Nimoy at that point. They knew him as a person. Unlike the Trekkies, who just saw him as Spock, these guys had grown up with him, essentially. They'd known him for years. They'd gotten to understand who he was and who he liked. And most of all, they shared his passion. They shared his passion for storytelling. They shared his passion for filmmaking, for directing. They even shared his passion for Star Trek. Why I'm here today is because a year ago, the same thing happened to me. There was a fellow who gave a talk at Motion in 2010, and he nominated me to speak in 2011. Now, I'd never given a public speech before, not really, not in this type of stage setting. But I came and I did it, and it went over well. And months later, I went to lunch with him, and I said, why did you nominate me for this? You know, like, you never saw me speak before. How did you think I could do this? And he said, well, because I know you care about storytelling. I know you're a good storyteller. And when he said that, he didn't have to say any more, because I knew how passionate my friend was about storytelling. So basically, he saw a little of himself in me. You know, he understood that we shared the same passion. So he was my Gene Roddenberry, or my Harve Bennett, in a sense. Another important thing happened. After I gave my speech, there was a fellow in the audience, not here today. He came up to me and said, I'd like you to teach a course. And eventually he told me, I'd like you to teach a course in screenwriting. Now, I'd never given a course in screenwriting before, and my speech last year at Motion had nothing to do with screenwriting. But the thing was, I had projected myself well enough to the audience, especially to this guy, of who I actually was and not who anybody thought I was based on what I did 10 years ago. So I actually kind of broke through, because this guy had no history with me. He could accept me as just someone who liked to talk to people, liked to tell people what to do, and who loved movies. Now, Leonard Nimoy's career path was unique. We're not all in positions where we can go back to what made us well-known in the first place and make millions of dollars and become a living legend and open the doors to other great work. As you know, he kind of caved in to returning to the thing that he had left many years before. But I guess he figured it wasn't a bad trade-off since he got to be a movie star and elevate his career much higher. So he was appreciative enough in 1995 to write a second autobiography saying, okay, fine. Now, for those of us trying to move on to more creative endeavors, we obviously don't have the advantages that Leonard Nimoy does. We can't go back to our old job and say, hey, you're paying a few $1 million for me to go back and do what I used to do because I'm ready. So we're kind of on our own. But nevertheless, there are lessons, I think, that we could all take from Leonard Nimoy's struggle to be taken seriously by people. The first is to have nerve. Now, it takes a lot of nerve to go out into the world and say, I am not Spock, or however you want to put it. That thing you think I do, well, I don't want to do it anymore. Or I'm not doing it anymore. Like, you have to get it out of your head. This is what I am, even if you think it's stupid, even if you think it's foolish, this is what I am. Second thing is comrades. There's Roddenberry. Now, comrades are everywhere. These are your champions, your paesani, if you want to put it in an Italian way. These are your fellow travelers, the people who get you, people who understand you. And these are the people who will put their necks out for you when you really want to get somewhere. And the hard part about, being alive is in sort of separating the wheat from the chaff, the Roddenberries from the Trekkies, the people who actually do really, truly understand you, like the guy who brought me here to Motion, and the people who are just kind of, you're just sort of this person in their head who just kind of did this thing 5 or 10 years ago or just can't move forward. But they're there. And the third thing is luck. Now, I don't really know what's going on in this picture. I don't even think Leonard Nimoy knows what's going on in this picture, but he's like, Star Trek, whatever. And this is kind of the elephant in the room, though. Whenever you talk about success, that there is always an element of luck. And it seems pointless for me to be standing here saying, hey, you want to be successful? Well, just get lucky. Just, win $1 million. But there is something to it. I read an interview with a successful person a few years ago. I don't remember who it was. It wasn't Leonard Nimoy. But they asked him, what is the secret to your success? And he said, luck. But then he followed up with something weird, and I swear he said this, even though it sounds like the strangest thing. He said, I got to where I am because of lucky breaks. But every human being on this planet, all 7 billion of us, get 8 lucky breaks a year. Now, you can call them lucky breaks, you can call them opportunities, whatever. But to quantify it as 8 is very democratic, and it's very generous. And the thing is, the problem is, I should say, is when you don't recognize it as a lucky break or an opportunity. Now, you're all here in Albuquerque at Motion today because you decided to take this chance. You could have all said no and stayed home. And maybe this weekend will do nothing for you. Or maybe it'll change your life. But the point is, you could see it as a lucky break that you were given, that you actually took advantage of, one of the 8 that you had for this year. You might have 7 left to go. There's still a couple months left. Or you might have already used some of them, and you could probably look back on your year and say, oh, that time I went to that party and met that certain someone and everything was great? Yeah, okay. That was one of my lucky breaks. So that was one of them. So the thing that I realized about these 3 elements is that they're all out there. Nerve obviously comes from within, and I admit it's the hardest part. I'm still working on it myself, the ability to go out and tell people what you really think of yourself and how you want them to see you. The second, comrades, you've got them right next to you here in this room. Hopefully, you could probably turn to the person next to you and make a comrade, a fellow traveler, someone who understands you and gets you right at the level you are because they have no history with you. They don't have this preconceived notion of who you are, who you're supposed to be. But it takes nerve, of course, to meet them, and it takes nerve to confide in them, to tell them that, for instance, you are an actor, not a waiter, that you are a live-action filmmaker, not an animator, that you are a Hollywood director, not Spock. And of course, luck is where you find it, but I do believe that having the nerve and having the comrades out there will direct you to that luck, to those opportunities. And I know, finally, it's kind of weird to be able to go up to people and say, I am not Spock, or I am not this, or I am not that. There is a great fear of looking arrogant or delusional or pretentious. But if you're at the point in your career where you'd rather be called arrogant, delusional, or pretentious than to be called Spock, then I think it's the most important creative decision you can make in your entire life. So with that, I thank you, and I hope you all live long and prosper.